Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. This story of the Magi and the journey under the star is often told just as we shared it with our children. It's a lovely tale about exotic pagan visitors bowing to the baby Jesus, bringing gifts fit for a king. In this version, we are given a great metaphor for inclusion and generosity and the power of God's love to break through those very human boundaries of race and creed and nationality that our religions are so often hung up on. We learn what it means to bring our gifts to God, even those the world may not rate as precious. This story is definitely about that. But it's also about something else, something a bit darker, a bit edgier. There is a side to this story which gives us a glimpse of the very worst of human nature in the midst of our charming nativity scenes. We don't like to look at that side on Christmas Eve, which is why we read the wonderfully affirming Gospel of Luke on that night. But 2 weeks later, we are faced with a different part of the message, one that is perhaps even more important than the chorus of angels singing. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas once said that sentimentality is the greatest enemy of the gospel. And I agree. When we gloss over the gospel's dark side, we wring it of its power to interrupt us and to challenge us and to change us. Its power to rock our world, which is exactly what the gospel stories are about, especially this one. For buried underneath the images of camel caravans and exotic gifts and angry kings and radiant stars is this question: what happens when our political and spiritual worlds collide? What happens when our comfortable positions are challenged and our privilege is threatened? In our story this morning, we encounter 3 magi, 3 wandering wise men, who go in search of a new political and spiritual reality. In different translations, they are called different things, but essentially they are astronomers, scholars, whose job it was to read the signs in the sky. Ancient people believed that the constellations could tell us much about the events of our world. And so when something unusual happened, something like the rising of a giant new star in the east, when something like that interrupted the expected order of the heavens, they sent their wisest people to investigate. On the other side of this story, we meet King Herod, who feels entirely differently about this cosmic interruption. For him, the possibility of a royal birth that the star foretold was not met with wonder and excitement, but with fear. Matthew tells us that not only is Herod afraid, but all of Jerusalem too. There was a ripple effect. You see, Herod ruled his people by fear. Appointed by the Roman emperor as king of the Jews, Herod's family dynasty owed all their power to Rome. Rather than rule with the good of the Jewish people in mind, Herod was all about keeping Rome happy. If it was good for the empire, it was good for him, he figured. So he taxed, and he exploited, and he bullied his people to keep them in line. And he brooked no threat to his power. So you can imagine how he felt when this band of traveling stargazers arrived in his palace searching for the newborn king of the Jews. Well, first he got scared, and then he got angry, and then he got violent. And that is the power of fear. When a person or a culture is faced with change, our first reaction is usually fear, especially if that change threatens to take away our position or our privilege. No one likes to give up power, and very few of us will do it voluntarily. And this birth of a new king, especially one who came from the peasant class, whose claim to power did not come from the empire but from God, this was a sign that the world was changing, that God had different plans than the ones that Herod had in mind, which was a problem, because Herod had built a pretty comfortable situation for himself. He had gotten in good with the powers. He had surrounded himself with wealth and luxury. He controlled the lives of his people with a wave of his hand. Who would let go of that? In our story, Herod is quite a caricature, really, of political power, a symbol of every leader who rules through oppression or fear. But to keep him locked in this ancient and symbolic role is really to miss the point of the story. For Herod exists in every age, in every culture. The world has always been full of insecure leaders threatened by challenges to their power, threatened by change. And even for those of us who don't live in a palace, change is hard. Even for those of us who don't think of ourselves as privileged, we don't want to let go of what we have. Many of us have indeed built very comfortable lives as part of a system of privilege. But the gospel stories, and the Christmas stories in particular, tell us that this tiny, vulnerable baby Jesus came to interrupt our power, to interrupt our privilege, and to show us that a whole new world is possible, if only we can let it go. We often think of power and privilege as a good thing, something to strive for. But in the context of authentic human community, in the context of our relationship with God, it comes with a cost. Because privilege needs to be protected, and doing that can keep us separated from each other. Privilege often keeps us entangled with the systems that create it, even when those systems result in a diminished life for others. Maintaining those systems can keep us in a constant state of fear and anxiety. Now, Herod had an obvious kind of privilege, but there are many more subtle kinds that keep us entrenched in ways that we may not even realize. Now, this question of privilege can push a lot of buttons. Believe me, I know. Few of us tend to think of ourselves as privileged. We may have trouble making ends meet. We may not see people who look like us on the covers of magazines or in the corridors of power. We may have our fair share of frustrations and heartaches in our lives. But if you are sitting in this church, on this corner of Montclair, in this time of history, I'm going to bet that you can claim some privilege. Whether you realize it or not, or like it or not, the vast majority of us are part of a system that wields some power over others. Powers we didn't earn. Powers we were born into. Are you male? Or white? Or raised in an educated home? Or able-bodied? Or straight? Or American? Or Christian? Some of us are all of the above. And that's some serious privilege, my friend. But any one of those puts us in a privileged class. Now, that doesn't mean that your life is easy, as I said. Even those of us who won the privilege lottery often have to work hard for what we have, but being privileged just means that by virtue of simply who we are, even if we didn't ask for it, the culture has given us some extra advantage, and therefore some power over others. And what often happens when that power gets threatened? Well, first we get frightened, and then we get mad. Now, one of the hallmarks of being privileged is that you generally don't realize that you are. You don't have to. You see, you are normal. Your gender, your color, your ability, your identity is the lens through which you see the world. We all do that. But when it is also the dominant lens of the world around you, then it is the normal lens. It is the default, and everyone else is an other. You didn't create this unequal system. You were born into it. And there is nothing inherently wrong with being born as you were, into privilege, unless it blinds you to the realities of those who are not, and unless you choose your own comfort over changing an unjust system. But one of the many advantages of being in the privileged group is that you have the power to ignore that, if you like. The other day I got a phone call from the Reverend Campbell Singleton, the new pastor at Union Baptist Church here in Montclair. As the leader of an historic African American congregation in town, Reverend Singleton has become passionate about conversations on race and the gospel, especially in light of the recent events regarding police behavior and people of color. He's holding an interfaith, community-wide Bible study on racism next month, and he asked me to host one of the sessions. Now, I was very excited to hear about this, and I was very pleased when I was asked to participate. So which one would you like me to do, I asked. White privilege and the gospel, he said. My first reaction, who said, oh no? Who out there said, oh no? My first reaction, I have to confess, was terror. Sheer terror. Look at me. I am the poster child for white privilege. Frankly, I'm the poster child for just about every privilege there is except for gender. I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm able-bodied, I'm straight, I'm educated, I'm American, and I'm Christian. Talk about winning the privilege lottery. And as enlightened as I strive to be about the reality of my less privileged brothers and sisters in this world, as much as I care, and I do deeply, I don't really understand what it means to be without privilege. I know I don't. And that's both my problem, and I hope, if I'm courageous enough, it's my salvation too. Because admitting that we don't really know each other is the first step to changing that. Because until those of us who are in positions of dominance, of access, of power, until we empty ourselves of that power and place ourselves at the feet to learn from those whom we oppress, we will miss the transformation that the gospel is all about. We will miss the point of Jesus' coming at all. As those wise seekers from the East soon learned, and much to their surprise, Jesus was not born into a privileged class. As they turned away from Herod's throne and recalibrated their journey to keep following the star, they had to leave those assumptions behind. Jesus' cradle wasn't in a palace, but a stall. If he had any claims to privilege, his maleness, for example, he let go of them, touching and healing and feeding and caring for others in a way that defied and angered the patriarchy he was raised in. Throughout his ministry, Jesus empowered women, bestowing them with dignity, teaching them as he taught the male disciples, and crossing the boundaries to invite them to follow him. He looked at the sick and the poor and the marginalized and saw brothers and sisters, and he risked his own status and ultimately his life to let them know that they were equally blessed in the eyes of God. In fact, Jesus didn't seek out those in power at all. He was not drawn to those who had built carefully guarded lives of comfort and ease. Instead, he came to interrupt their privilege and to challenge their power, not to gain dominance for himself, but to show us that the only true way to touch the heart of God is to empty ourselves of all that crowds it out. That's how he lived, and that's how he died. And he taught that even more than our possessions, than our stuff, it is our worldview, our perception of ourselves, that blinds us most to the presence of God. That's why so many of his parables and miracles had to do with restoring sight and bringing light into the darkness. It's why so many of his teachings angered the Pharisees and the high priests and the Roman rulers, because he saw right through their privilege and dared them to step out from behind it to find real life, authentic life in God. Friends, we did not create the culture we were born into, but those of us who are privileged by it have a responsibility to see it and name it, and act to change it. For when we allow our privileges to distort our vision and keep us from changing an unjust system that just perpetuates them, we are choosing blindness, and we are closing our hearts to God's dream for the world. Herod was threatened by that dream. He was threatened by the power of Jesus to see past his palace and his privilege and into his heart. And the truth is, most of us are too. So what privilege are you hiding behind? What prevents you from seeing Christ in those around you, or from touching the heart of God in one another, especially in those who live lives without privilege? Is it fear? Is it anger? What would you lose if you let your privilege go? We may feel lost for a while, but that is not altogether a bad thing. Sometimes we need to lose our way before we can find it again. Just ask those magi. Sometimes getting lost is the best way to find where God is waiting for us. And sometimes letting go of who we are is the best way to become who God is calling us to be. Thanks be to God. Amen.